the managing director and chief technology officer of the organization that holds $90 trillion in financial assets, just went on camera and said 6 words that should have stopped every financial market in the world. We expect it much sooner than any of you think. He wasn't talking about a product launch. He wasn't talking about a pilot program. He was talking about tokenizing every asset in the DTCC's inventory and delivering it to qualified public blockchains. $90 trillion, public blockchains, sooner than anyone thinks, and the price of XRP barely moved. Here is what makes this genuinely strange. The DTCC does not make public statements carelessly. It is the backbone of U.S. securities settlement, the institution responsible for clearing and settling the majority of U.S. securities transactions, valued at $2.5 quadrillion annually. Its executives speak with the precision of people who know that markets move on their words. Daniel Donahue, managing director and CTO, did not say we're exploring or we're evaluating. He said we are racing. Racing, present tense, active, urgent. And somewhere inside that race, the DTCC filed a patent that explicitly names one specific asset as the digital liquidity token in its tokenized system. So here is the question that nobody in mainstream financial media is asking. If the DTCC is racing to bring $90 trillion on-chain, and their own patent names XRP as the bridge asset, and Ripple Prime is already embedded inside the DTCC's operational directory as a clearing and netting participant, why is $16 trillion in annual volume that runs through Ripple's own infrastructure sitting completely untouched by digital assets? Not partially touched, not 1%, 0. Brad Garlinghouse confirmed it himself. Not $1, not one transaction. The light switch exists, it has a name, and it has never been flipped. What happens to XRP the day someone flips it? Welcome to XRP News Flow Signals, where we map the architecture before the volume data makes it undeniable. No price predictions, no hopium. We read the patents, the directory filings, the regulatory approvals, and the on-record statements from the people building this infrastructure. And we show you exactly where we are in the deployment sequence. This is not financial advice. Do your own research. But if you want to understand the precise mechanics of what the DTCC Ripple Prime connection actually means, and what $16 trillion waiting to flip a switch implies for supply, stay with me. This one goes deep. Let's start with the hard truth that most XRP coverage gets structurally wrong about the DTCC relationship. Because the misunderstanding is costing people clarity at exactly the moment clarity matters most. The common framing in the community is binary. Either the DTCC is using XRP or it isn't. That framing misses the actual architecture entirely. Here is what the documentation actually shows. At the DTCC layer, the DTCC subsidiaries, the NSCC, the DTC, and the FICC still clear and settle traditional instruments using their own central ledgers, risk models, and Federal Reserve accounts. The DTCC's public documents do not reference the XRP Ledger directly. That part of the common framing is accurate. But here's where the architecture becomes structurally significant. Ripple Prime, formerly Hidden Road, is now an operational participant inside the DTCC's infrastructure. Specifically, an FICC GSD netting participant since March 2025 and added to the NSCC directory for OTC trading clearing in March 2026. That means Ripple Prime clears and settles clients' trades inside the DTCC system, functioning like any other clearing broker in the DTCC's taxonomy. And simultaneously, Ripple Prime has integrated the XRP Ledger into its post-trade operations, with plans to migrate significant clearing activity onto the XRP Ledger to reduce settlement time and cost. The architecture, Ripple Prime lives on both sides of the bridge. On one side, it interfaces with the DTCC in fiat and conventional securities, clearing obligations, netting, settlement in US dollars. On the other side, It manages post-trade flows, collateral, and settlement on the XRP Ledger using XRP for settlement liquidity and RLUSD as eligible collateral. This is an indirect but structurally real connection. Not the DTCC natively using XRP, but a DTCC participant that is simultaneously embedded in DTCC infrastructure and XRP Ledger infrastructure, operating as the bridge between them. Think of it this way. The DTCC does not need to adopt XRP. The participant sitting inside the DTCC's clearing infrastructure already runs on XRP rails. Every institutional client of Ripple Prime that routes trades through DTCC clearing can have their post-trade settlement, collateral management, and liquidity operations handled on the XRP Ledger, while their DTCC-facing obligations are met in conventional fiat and securities. That is not a theory. That is the documented operational structure of a firm that is now a registered member of the NSCC, the FICC, the CME, CFTC registration, FINRA, and the SIPC, all simultaneously, and all connected to the XRP Ledger. But here is what nobody is talking about yet, and it changes the entire picture of what comes next. But the DTCC connection is actually not the most important number in this story. The number that should be keeping every XRP analyst awake at night is $13 trillion, and what Brad Garlinghouse said about it. We'll get there. But first, you need to understand what the DTCC patent actually says, because it is far more specific than anyone has reported. The DTCC patent filed in 2025 does not reference blockchain technology generically. It does not describe a digital asset in abstract terms. It specifically describes a digital liquidity token in the context of a tokenized liquidity system, and it explicitly identifies XRP as a candidate for that role, describing routing logic in the form of asset A, XRP, asset B across different ledgers. That is a patent, a legal document, filed by the organization holding $90 trillion in assets, naming XRP as the bridge mechanism in their tokenized liquidity architecture. You do not put a specific asset name in a patent without having evaluated that asset against technical specifications. Patent filings reflect concluded analysis, not aspirational speculation. The DTCC's legal team reviewed and approved that language. Now let's do the math that this patent implies. The DTCC processes approximately 2.5 quadrillion in annual transaction value across all its operations. Of the $90 trillion it holds in inventory, a meaningful fraction is in assets that could be tokenized and moved across chains. U.S. Treasuries, equities, ETFs. If XRP functions as the bridge asset in even a small percentage of that cross-ledger movement, 0.1% of the inventory value routing through XRP annually, that represents $90 billion in annual XPR settled flow. At 0.5%, $450 billion. At 1%, $900 billion. These are not projections. These are the mechanical outputs of applying the patent's described routing logic to the DTCC's known inventory at any percentage of adoption. Now layer on the two companies Ripple acquired. G Treasury, now Ripple Treasury, processes approximately $13 trillion in annual transactional volume. Brad Garlinghouse confirmed on record, not $1 of that $13 trillion has used digital assets, stablecoins, or crypto in any form. 0. Ripple Prime, formerly Hidden Road, processes approximately $3 trillion in annual volume, with more than 300 institutional clients. Combined, $16 trillion in annual transactional volume sitting inside infrastructure that Ripple now owns and operates, with zero digital asset utilization as of Garlinghouse's most recent public statement. Now add the Chainalysis projection for context. Stablecoin volume is projected to reach $719 trillion by 2035 at a 133% annual growth rate. Add generational wealth transfer and merchant adoption, and the total addressable market approaches $1.5 quadrillion in payment flow that needs settlement infrastructure. The XRP Ledger handles 1,500 transactions per second, settlement in under 5 seconds, fees in fractions of a cent. The supply math: XRP has a fixed 100 billion token supply. Transaction fees permanently burn a fraction with each settlement. As volume scales through Ripple Prime, G Treasury, and DTCC adjacent flows, the burn rate compounds against the supply that cannot expand. 16 trillion waiting, a patent naming XRP as the bridge, a burn rate that scales with volume, a supply that cannot increase. The math does not require optimism, it requires arithmetic. Now, you might be wondering, if all of this is documented, if the infrastructure is in place, if the patent is filed, why hasn't the market priced any of it in? The answer is in something that happened on April 30th, 2026, and most of the community hasn't connected it to the Ripple Prime story yet. Let me show you. On April 30th, 2026, the DTCC and CME Group received joint approval from the SEC and CFTC to expand their existing U.S. Treasury cross-margining arrangement to end-user clients of duly registered broker-dealers and futures commission merchants. Ripple Prime is a registered broker-dealer. What this means in practice: eligible U.S. Treasury positions held at the FICC can now be offset against interest rate futures at the CME for clients of qualifying broker-dealers. This creates a cross-margining bridge between the two most important clearing institutions in American finance. And Ripple Prime, as an FICC participant and registered broker-dealer, is positioned as a potential conduit for its institutional clients to access those cross-margining benefits. This is not Ripple being handed a product. This is Ripple Prime's DTCC and CME memberships creating an access pathway that did not exist before April 30th. Now connect this to the on-record statements from XRP Tokyo. At XRP Tokyo, a senior developer described the XRP Ledger as a financial operating system, and specifically noted that Ripple is deploying AI at the protocol layer to fortify defensive aspects of the ledger, expose vulnerabilities, and improve invariance, the foundational rules that must hold true across every transaction. This is not product marketing. This is the language of institutions preparing infrastructure for industrial-scale deployment. You harden a codebase with AI-assisted security auditing when the volume you are preparing for could break things that have never been stress-tested at that scale before. Add the Ripple Treasury trademark filed April 15th, 2026, formalizing the rebrand of G Treasury into the Ripple ecosystem with unified branding. When a company files a trademark for an acquisition it made at $1.25 billion, it is signaling operational integration, not shelf warehousing. The trademark is the public signal that the 13 trillion in G Treasury volume is being prepared for deployment on Ripple's rails. Garlinghouse said it himself: when the legislation lands, the news will come so fast and crazy, it'll be hard to keep track of. Press release buttons already on standby. Announcements waiting for the legal trigger. The Clarity Act is the trigger. The infrastructure is the gun. The 16 trillion is the ammunition. But here's the part most channels won't say out loud, because it complicates the clean bullish narrative. There is something specific about how the DTCC Ripple Prime connection actually works that means XRP's role is conditional, not guaranteed. And understanding that distinction is what separates the investors who position correctly from the ones who get disappointed later. Let me be precise about this. Here is what precise analysis requires saying clearly, because trust is built on accuracy, not on telling people what they want to hear. The DTCC itself is not using XRP. The DTCC's own central ledgers, risk models, and settlement systems operate in fiat and conventional securities. When the DTCC CTO says, "We're racing to bring 90 trillion on-chain," the on-chain destination is qualified public and private blockchains, chosen through the DTCC's own selection process. XRP is named in their patent as a candidate, not as a confirmed primary settlement layer. The honest picture is this. Ripple Prime is the bridge, not the DTCC. Ripple Prime clears DTCC-related transactions for its clients and then internally settles, hedges, or collateralizes those exposures using XRP. The XRP usage happens on Ripple Prime's side of the bridge, not inside the DTCC's own clearing infrastructure. That distinction matters for two reasons. First, it means XRP's DTCC adjacent volume depends on the growth of Ripple Prime's institutional client base, which currently serves 300-plus clients at $3 trillion in annual volume. That is significant, but not the full $90 trillion. Second, the path from Ripple Prime's current XRP usage to the DTCC itself, natively using XRP, what would be truly game-changing, requires the DTCC to make its own technology decisions that have not been announced. What we have today is a structurally real but indirect connection. An indirect connection to a $90 trillion institution with a $16 trillion combined annual volume in Ripple's own infrastructure that has used zero digital assets so far. The honest assessment: the infrastructure is assembled, the membership is established, the patent is filed, the trademark is live, and not $1 has moved yet. That is not bearish. That is the description of a loaded system where the activation event is the only remaining variable. I want to be direct here for a moment. What we just mapped, the patent language, the NSCC directory, the April 30th cross-margining approval, the $16 trillion light switch, and the honest nuance about what the DTCC is and isn't doing directly. This is the level of structural analysis that requires reading the actual filings, not the headlines about the filings. If you want this in your feed every week, the signal without the noise, the architecture without the hype, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals right now and turn on notifications. Because the next development in this sequence, the first published data showing Ripple Prime migrating clearing activity onto the XRP Ledger at scale, is the event that converts everything we just mapped from analysis into evidence. You want the framework already built when that happens. That is what this channel is here to provide. Let's map the specific trigger sequence with precision, because vague timelines are not useful. Trigger 1. DTCC CME cross-margining goes live April 30th, 2026. Already approved. Already scheduled. Ripple Prime, as a registered broker-dealer, is positioned as a conduit for institutional clients accessing these cross-margining benefits. The April 30th launch is not a future event. It is imminent. Watch for Ripple Prime client volume data in the weeks following. Trigger 2. Clarity Act Senate passage. Garlinghouse confirmed press releases are queued. Announcements waiting for the legislative trigger. G Treasury's $13 trillion in volume is the most specific weighting asset. When the Clarity Act passes, the internal approvals that have been pending legal clarity execute simultaneously. Trigger 3. DTCC Tokenization Service, H2 2026. Confirmed by DTCC leadership. $90 trillion in inventory. Qualified public blockchains named as the destination. XRP named in their patent as the bridge asset. The H2 2026 timeline is not speculative. It was stated publicly by DTCC's own leadership with the word racing. Trigger 4. Ripple Prime XRP Ledger migration announcement. Ripple Prime has stated plans to migrate significant clearing activity onto the XRP Ledger. The migration announcement, when it comes, is the event that makes the $3 trillion annual volume figure a directly measurable XRP demand source. It is the first number that translates infrastructure into transaction volume. 4 triggers, all on a defined timeline within the next 6 to 12 months. None requiring speculation about technology that does not exist. And there is one more piece of this that almost nobody is tracking. A number that makes the $16 trillion look like a down payment. Stay with me for 90 more seconds. This is the part that reframes the entire thesis. Chainalysis projects stablecoin settlement volume reaching $719 trillion by 2035 through organic growth alone. Add the $100 trillion generational wealth transfer currently underway and merchant adoption at scale, and total payment infrastructure demand approaches $1.5 quadrillion. That is the market the XRP Ledger is being positioned to serve. Not 100%, not even 10%. But if the ledger that processes settlement for Ripple Prime, G Treasury, and DTCC adjacent flows captures even a fraction of the addressable infrastructure demand in a $719 trillion stablecoin settlement market, the burn math on a fixed 100 billion token supply does not produce gradual price appreciation. It produces a repricing event. The XRP Ledger has been described by its own developers as a financial operating system, not a payments token, not a bridge asset, but the foundational layer on which institutional financial infrastructure runs. That framing is not marketing. It is the architectural aspiration being backed by hundreds of millions in acquisition spending, AI-hardened protocol development, DTCC membership, CME membership, and a patent that names XRP as the bridge in a $90 trillion tokenization roadmap. $16 trillion sitting at zero digital asset utilization, a light switch with a name, and a supply that cannot expand to meet the demand when it arrives. Let me leave you with the complete picture assembled. The DTCC CTO said, "We're racing to bring 90 trillion on-chain sooner than any of you think." The DTCC patent names XRP as the bridge asset in their tokenized liquidity system. Ripple Prime holds membership in the NSCC, FICC, CME, CFTC registration, FINRA, and SIPC simultaneously, all on the XRP Ledger. G Treasury, now Ripple Treasury, processes $13 trillion annually. Ripple Prime processes $3 trillion, combined $16 trillion. Digital assets used, 0. Brad Garlinghouse, not $1, not one transaction. The light switch is waiting. April 30th, 2026, DTCC CME cross-margining goes live. Ripple Prime, as a registered broker-dealer, is positioned inside it. The Clarity Act, the legislative trigger that cues the press releases already written. The XRP Ledger, described by its own developers as a financial operating system being hardened with AI for industrial-scale institutional deployment. This is not a story about potential. It is a story about sequencing. The infrastructure is assembled, the memberships are held, the patents are filed, the trademark is live. The 16 trillion is sitting in a room with a light switch. The switch has a name, and the supply of the asset it runs on cannot increase to meet the demand when someone finally flips it. If this structural read of the DTCC Ripple Prime architecture clarified where we actually are in the deployment sequence, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the April 30th cross-margining launch produces its first institutional data. We track the filings, the directory listings, the patent language, and the on-record statements, and we map them into a coherent sequence before the volume data makes it undeniable. Drop one word below, switch, if the $16 trillion light switch framing landed for you. Let's see who is reading the architecture. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.